My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and I am 83 years old. For 60 years I have carried a secret so terrible, so impossible, that I convinced myself it was better left buried. But now, as I feel my time drawing near, I can no longer bear the weight of silence. What I'm about to tell you happened when I was 23, fresh out of college, and foolishly certain that the world held no mysteries I couldn't solve with logic and reason. How wrong I was. It was the autumn of 1963 when I took the position as librarian at Millbrook Academy, a prestigious boarding school nestled deep in the Vermont mountains. The pay was modest, but the promise of organizing their legendary rare book collection was too tempting to refuse. I had always been drawn to old things, ancient texts, forgotten histories, the whispered secrets that lived between yellowed pages. The set headmaster, Dr. Augustus Pembridge, was a distinguished gentleman in his 70s with silver hair and eyes like winter frost. During my interview, he seemed pleased with my credentials but grew strangely serious when discussing the collection. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, "the collection contains materials that are, shall we say, sensitive. Some of our books date back centuries and deal with subjects that modern minds might find disturbing. I trust you understand the importance of discretion." I assured him I did, though I had no idea what I was agreeing to. The library was housed in the oldest building on campus, a Gothic structure of dark stone that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. My first few weeks were spent cataloging standard academic texts, Latin primers, histories of ancient Rome, philosophical treatises. It was pleasant, methodical work that suited my temperament perfectly. The restricted section was kept behind a locked gate in the library's basement. Dr. Pembridge had given me the key with strict instructions that these books were for faculty, research only, and were never to be removed from the premises. For the first month, I respected these boundaries, focusing on the general collection upstairs. But curiosity, as they say, killed the cat. It began with small things, books that weren't where I'd left them, whispers in the stacks when I knew I was alone, the distinct feeling of being watched, though I never saw anyone. I told myself it was the natural creaking of an old building, the wind through loose windows, the overactive imagination of someone spending too much time alone with dusty tomes. Then I found the first letter. It was tucked between the pages of a 17th century treatise on astronomy, written in shaky handwriting on cream-colored paper. "They're watching me. I know they are. The children see them too, but the headmaster forbids us to speak of it. God help us all, they're not human." MF, November 1958. I stared at the letter for a long time, my hands trembling slightly. MF could have been anyone, a former student perhaps, or another librarian. But something about the desperate scrawl, the way the ink seemed to bleed with fear, made my skin crawl. Over the following days I found more letters hidden throughout the collection, like desperate messages in bottles cast into an ocean of indifference. The headmaster brought us down to see them tonight, made us swear an oath of silence. Tommy Webster tried to run and they... Dear God, what they did to Tommy. We're not allowed to speak of it, but I had to write this down. Someone needs to know. J.R., March 1962. Found 3 more bodies in the woods. Animals, they said. But animals don't arrange bones in perfect circles. Animals don't carve symbols into tree bark with surgical precision. The police won't listen. They're part of it now. Anonymous, October 1961. Each letter was more disturbing than the last, painting a picture of something wrong at Millbrook Academy, something that had been wrong for years. The dates spanned decades, going back to the 1920s. Different handwriting, different names, but always the same themes. Watchers in the shadows, children who disappeared, authorities who covered up the truth. I should have left then. Should have packed my bags and fled back to the safety of the city. Instead, I found myself drawn deeper into the mystery, spending my evenings poring over the letters, trying to piece together a coherent narrative from fragments of terror. The breakthrough came when I discovered that MF was Margaret Finch, a former librarian who had worked at Millbrook from 1955 to 1959. According to the school records, she had left suddenly due to a nervous condition. I managed to track down her address in a nearby town, and against every instinct screaming at me to let sleeping dogs lie, I paid her a visit. Margaret Finch lived in a small cottage at the end of a dead-end road, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to press against her windows like living things. She was in her 60s, with wild gray hair and eyes that darted constantly to the shadows. When I introduced myself as the current Millbrook librarian, she went pale as winter moonlight. "You shouldn't have come here," she whispered, pulling me inside with surprising strength. They watch the roads, they know when someone gets too close to the truth. Her living room was a fortress of newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten notes covering every available surface. Red string connected various pieces of evidence like a spider's web of paranoia. But as she began to explain, I realized it wasn't paranoia at all. It was the meticulous documentation of something unthinkable. "It started in 1897, Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Augustus Pemberton's great-grandfather, Ezekiel Pemberton, founded the school. But that's not all he founded. There are things in those woods, Miss Hartwell. Ancient things that hunger for young minds, young souls. The Pembertons made a deal with them long ago. Protection and prosperity in exchange for tribute. She showed me photographs dating back decades. Aerial shots of the woods surrounding Millbrook, revealing patterns in the tree line that formed unmistakable symbols when viewed from above. Newspaper clippings about missing children from nearby towns, always during the school term, always dismissed as runaways or accidents. Police reports that had been mysteriously sealed or lost. Every few years they choose students." Margaret continued, her hands shaking as she sorted through the evidence. "Quiet ones, loners, children whose disappearance won't cause too much fuss. The official story is always the same. Tragic accidents, running away, suicide. But I've seen what really happens in those woods, Miss Hartwell. I've seen the ceremonies." She pulled out a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. "This belonged to Sarah Whitmore, a student who disappeared in 1958. I found it hidden in the restricted section after she vanished. Read it." With trembling fingers, I opened the journal to a random page. October 15th, 1958. "Dr. Pembridge called me to his office today. Said I'd been chosen for a special honor, that I was going to help the school in a very important way. He seemed different somehow. His eyes were too bright, and when he smiled, I swear his teeth looked sharper than before. He told me not to mention our conversation to anyone, especially not the other students. Said it would be our little secret until the ceremony. I'm scared. There have been too many disappearances this year. First Jenny Morrison in September, then David Kello just last week. Everyone says they ran away, but I found Jenny's locket in the woods behind the chapel. She would never have left without it. Something is wrong at this school. Something has always been wrong here." The journal entries grew more desperate, documenting Sarah's growing awareness of the danger she was in. The final entry was dated October 31st, 1958. "They're coming for me tonight. I can hear them moving through the halls, their footsteps like whispers on stone. Dr. Pembridge is with them, but he's not Dr. Pembridge anymore. None of them are quite human anymore. If someone finds this, please know that I tried to run. I tried to warn the others, but the woods are alive with things that should not be, and there is nowhere to hide from what Millbrook Academy has become. Tell my parents I love them. Tell them I fought until the end." Margaret closed the journal with reverent care. Sarah Whitmore was officially listed as a suicide, supposedly threw herself from the chapel bell tower. But there was no body, Miss Hartwell. There's never a body. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process what I was hearing. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as the ravings of a disturbed woman, but the evidence was overwhelming. Too many coincidences, too many patterns, too many voices crying out from the past about the same inexplicable horrors. What are they? I finally managed to ask. These things in the woods? Margaret's eyes grew distant, haunted. I only saw them once during my last week at the school. I was working late in the library when I heard voices from the restricted section. Dr. Pembridge was down there with several faculty members, and they were chanting in a language I'd never heard before. Words that seemed to crawl under my skin like living things. She paused, her breath coming in short, sharp gasps. I crept down the stairs and peered through the gate. They had formed a circle around an open book, not one from our collection, something bound in what looked like human skin. As they chanted, the air began to shimmer, and I saw shapes. Tall, impossibly thin figures with too many joints, moving in ways that hurt to watch. Their faces were voids of absolute darkness, and from those voids came whispers in hundreds of different voices. All the children who had vanished over the years. I felt ice water flooding my veins. What did you do? I ran. Packed my bags that very night and left without notice. I've been documenting everything ever since, trying to find someone who would believe me, someone brave enough to expose the truth. But they have influence, Miss Hartwell. The Pembertons have money, connections, power. Anyone who gets too close to the truth either disappears or has their credibility destroyed. Margaret grabbed my hands with desperate strength. You have access to the restricted section. You can find proof that even they can't explain away, but you must be careful. They know when someone is getting close to the truth, and they'll do anything to protect their secret. I left Margaret's cottage that evening with my worldview fundamentally shattered. Everything I thought I knew about reality had been turned upside down, replaced by something far more sinister and impossible to accept. But I couldn't simply ignore what I'd learned. Those letters, that journal, the decades of missing children, it all pointed to a horror that was still ongoing, still claiming young lives in service to something ancient and hungry. Back at Millbrook, I began my investigation in earnest. I spent hours in the restricted section, searching through books that predated the school's founding, looking for anything that might explain the Pembertons' dark bargain. Most of the texts were in Latin or other dead languages, but I found enough English translations to piece together fragments of the truth. The land where Millbrook Academy stood had been considered cursed by the local indigenous peoples long before European settlers arrived. They spoke of hungry shadows that dwelt in the deep woods, entities that fed on human suffering and could be appeased only through ritual sacrifice. When Ezekiel Pemberton purchased the land in 1897, he claimed to be building a school to educate young minds. In reality, he was establishing a feeding ground for things that should have remained buried in folklore. The worst part was discovering that the arrangement was still active, still ongoing. Current student records showed the same patterns Margaret had documented. Quiet, isolated children who disappeared without explanation. Their absences covered up with increasingly creative lies. The school's remarkable success rate, its prestigious reputation, the way graduates went on to positions of power and influence. It all made sense now. The entities in the woods didn't just feed on children's lives, they fed on their potential, their futures, their dreams. And Dr. Pembridge, the man who had hired me with such careful attention to discretion, was the latest in a long line of guardians, maintaining this unholy covenant. I should have contacted the authorities then. Should have gone to the police, the FBI, anyone who might have listened. Instead, I made the mistake of confronting Dr. Pembridge directly. It was a Friday evening in late November when I knocked on his office door, armed with photocopies of the most damning evidence I'd collected. He invited me in with his usual courtly manner, offering tea and inquiring about my progress with the collection. His demeanor remained pleasant, even as I laid out the letters, the photographs, the documented disappearances spanning decades. "My dear Miss Hartwell," he said when I finished, his voice carrying the same cultured tone but somehow different underneath, like silk stretched over steel. "I'm afraid you've been reading too many Gothic novels. These are the fantasies of disturbed minds, nothing more." "Sarah Whitmore's journal isn't a fantasy," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "Neither are the missing children, the covered-up deaths, the patterns that go back to your great-grandfather's time." Dr. Pembridge's smile never wavered, but something shifted behind his eyes. The winter frost I'd noticed during my interview had deepened into something colder, more alien. "You're a bright young woman, Eleanor. Far too bright for your own good, it seems. Tell me, what do you think you're going to do with this research?" "I'm going to expose the truth. I'm going to make sure no more children disappear into your woods." He laughed then, a sound like glass breaking in reverse. "My dear child, do you really think you're the first person to stumble upon our little secret? Do you think Margaret Finch was the first librarian to piece together the truth? You're simply the latest in a long line of crusaders, each convinced they alone could bring justice to the world." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. "What happened to the others?" "The same thing that's going to happen to you, I'm afraid. You see, Eleanor, there are rules to this arrangement, agreements that must be honored. The entities we serve are very particular about maintaining their privacy. They don't appreciate exposure, and they're quite creative in their methods of ensuring silence." Dr. Pembridge rose from his chair, and I noticed for the first time how he moved. Too fluid, too graceful, as if his joints worked in ways human joints shouldn't. "You have a choice, my dear. You can join us willingly, become part of the covenant that has protected this institution for over a century. Or you can join us unwillingly. And trust me when I say that the latter option is far less pleasant." "Ran." I burst from his office and sprinted through the corridors of the old building, my footsteps echoing off stone walls like gunshots. Behind me, I could hear Dr. Pembridge calling my name, but his voice had changed, become something inhuman, that spoke in harmonics no human throat could produce. I made it to my apartment in the faculty housing complex and frantically began packing. My hands shook so badly I could barely fold clothes into my suitcase. But adrenaline drove me forward. I had to get away from Millbrook, had to find someone who would believe me, who would listen to the evidence I'd collected. That's when I heard the knock at my door. "Miss Hartwell?" Dr. Pembridge's voice, perfectly normal again, cultured and concerned. "I'm afraid we got off on the wrong foot earlier. Perhaps we could discuss this situation like civilized adults." I said nothing, barely breathing as I crept toward the window. My apartment was on the second floor, but there was a fire escape that would get me to the ground safely. From there, I could reach my car and drive away from this nightmare forever. "Eleanor, I know you're in there. There's really nowhere to run, you know. The roads out of town all pass through our woods, and the woods... well, the woods have eyes." I eased the window open as quietly as possible and stepped onto the fire escape. The metal groaned under my weight, and I froze, listening for any sign that I'd been discovered. Dr. Pembridge was still talking to my door, his voice taking on that strange harmonic quality again, but he seemed unaware of my escape attempt. The descent to the ground took an eternity, each step careful and deliberate to minimize noise. When I finally reached the parking lot, I could see other faculty members emerging from their apartments, all moving with that same unnatural grace I'd noticed in Dr. Pembridge. They were spreading out, searching, and I realized with growing horror that the entire faculty was part of whatever unholy covenant governed Millbrook Academy. My car was parked at the far end of the lot, and reaching it meant crossing 30 yards of open ground. I took a deep breath and ran, my footsteps loud as thunderclaps in the November night. Behind me I heard shouts, voices calling my name in tones that were no longer human. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them into the ignition. The engine turned over with a roar that seemed deafening in the silence, and I threw the car into reverse, tires screaming against asphalt as I backed out of the parking space. The faculty members were converging on my position, but they moved. Wrong. Too fast and too coordinated, like a flock of birds changing direction in perfect unison. In my rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of Dr. Pembridge's face, and what I saw there made me press the accelerator to the floor. His features were shifting, rearranging themselves into something that had never been human. His eyes were black voids that seemed to extend infinitely inward, and his mouth had opened far too wide, revealing rows of teeth like broken glass. I raced down the winding road that led away from Millbrook Academy, my headlights cutting through darkness that seemed almost solid. The trees on either side of the road pressed close, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out the stars. Every shadow seemed to move. Every glimpse of motion in my peripheral vision made my heart race faster. That's when I realized I wasn't alone in the car. The temperature had dropped so suddenly that my breath came out in visible puffs, and the air itself seemed to thicken, becoming difficult to breathe. In my rearview mirror, I saw a shape forming in the back seat. Tall, impossibly thin, with joints that bent in directions that hurt to contemplate. Eleanor, it whispered, and its voice was the sound of wind through empty spaces, of children crying in places where no children should be. You cannot leave. You know too much. You've seen too much. I screamed and jerked the steering wheel hard to the right, sending the car sliding sideways across the asphalt. The entity in the back seat flickered like a bad television signal, its form becoming translucent for a moment before solidifying again. The Covenant is eternal, it continued, reaching forward with fingers that were too long, too sharp. The Pembertons made their bargain in blood and dreams, and we honor our agreements. You will return to the school, Eleanor. You will take your place among the faithful, or you will feed the darkness that lives beneath the roots of our sacred trees. The car spun out of control, sliding toward the edge of the road where the forest waited like an open mouth. I fought the steering wheel, trying to regain control, but the entity's presence seemed to be affecting the car itself. The engine sputtered, the lights flickered, and the radio burst to life with a sound like children screaming. In desperation, I did the only thing I could think of. I recited the Lord's Prayer, shouting it at the top of my lungs as the car careened toward the tree line. The entity recoiled as if struck, its form wavering like smoke in a strong wind. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. There, car's engine roared back to life, and I managed to pull out of the spin just inches from the forest edge. The entity in the back seat let out a sound like breaking glass and dissipated into nothing, leaving only the lingering smell of decay and the echo of children's voices. I drove through the night, not stopping until I reached the state police barracks 50 miles away. I told them everything. The letters, the journals, the missing children, the inhuman faculty of Millbrook Academy. They listened politely, took notes, and promised to investigate. I could see in their eyes that they thought I was having some kind of breakdown, but they were kind enough not to say so directly. The investigation, such as it was, turned up nothing. Millbrook Academy's records were pristine, their faculty respected members of the educational community. The missing children I documented were explained away as runaways, suicides, or tragic accidents, exactly as Margaret Finch had predicted. My evidence was dismissed as the product of an overactive imagination combined with the stress of a new job. Within a week, I received a call from Dr. Pembridge himself. "Miss Hartwell," he said, his voice perfectly normal again, warm and concerned. "I understand you've been going through a difficult time, The pressures of academic life can be overwhelming, especially for someone in their first professional position. I want you to know that Millbrook Academy bears you no ill will. In fact, we'd like to offer you a generous severance package to help you transition to new opportunities. The severance package was indeed generous, enough money to keep me comfortable for several years while I decided on my next career move. It came with only one condition: a non-disclosure agreement that prevented me from discussing my time at Millbrook Academy or making any public statements about the school, its faculty, or its students. I signed it. God help me. I signed it and took their blood money because I was 23 years old and terrified and convinced that no one would ever believe me anyway. I told myself that I would find another way to expose the truth, that the money would give me time to gather more evidence, to build a case that couldn't be dismissed. But days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and gradually the sharp edges of my memories began to blur. I found work at a public library in Boston, threw myself into a normal life with normal concerns. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night with the taste of decay in my mouth and the sound of children crying in my ears. But those episodes became less frequent as the years passed. I convinced myself that I had imagined it all, that the stress of my first job had caused some kind of psychological break. It was easier that way, safer to live in a world where ancient entities didn't hunger in dark woods and respected institutions didn't feed their students to horrors beyond human understanding. For 60 years, I maintained that fiction. I married a good man, raised 2 children, built a quiet life far from the mountains of Vermont and the shadows that lived there. I never spoke of Millbrook Academy to anyone, never violated the terms of my agreement with Dr. Pembridge. But now I'm dying. The doctors say I have perhaps 6 months left, and I find that the approach of death has a way of clarifying one's priorities. The non-disclosure agreement dies with me, and I refuse to take this secret to my grave. Last month, I hired a private investigator to look into Millbrook Academy's current operations. What he found confirms my worst fears. The school is still active, still claiming young lives in service to whatever unholy bargain the Pembertons made over a century ago. The methods have evolved, become more sophisticated, but the pattern remains the same. Isolated children continue to disappear, their absences explained by increasingly creative cover stories. Margaret Finch died in 1987, officially of natural causes, though she was found in her cottage surrounded by evidence of her decades-long investigation into Millbrook Academy. The police ruled it a heart attack brought on by paranoid delusions. Her research was destroyed, dismissed as the obsessive ravings of a mentally ill woman. But I remember what she showed me. I remember Sarah Whitmore's journal, the letters hidden throughout the library, the photographs that revealed symbols carved into the very landscape around the school. Most importantly, I remember the thing that materialized in my back seat on that terrifying night in 1963, and I know with absolute certainty that what I experienced was real. Dr. Augustus Pembridge died in 1995 at the age of 102, an impossibly advanced age that should have raised questions but didn't. His son, Dr. Marcus Pembridge, now runs the school with the same cultured demeanor and the same inhuman coldness behind his eyes. The covenant continues, the bargain remains in force, and every few years, new children disappear into woods that hunger for young souls. I've tried to contact current faculty members, hoping to find someone like myself who stumbled onto the truth and might be willing to speak out. Most don't respond to my letters. Those who do send polite but firm refusals, citing their commitment to student privacy and institutional loyalty. Reading between the lines, I can see the same fear that kept me silent for 6 decades. The same crushing awareness that some truths are too dangerous to speak aloud. But silence is complicity, and I refuse to be complicit any longer, to anyone. Reading this account, I offer the following evidence. Sarah Whitmore's journal, which I managed to steal from the restricted section before my hasty departure from Millbrook Academy. Margaret Finch's research files, which I retrieved from her cottage after her death. Photographs and documents spanning nearly a century of covered-up disappearances. Names, dates, locations, everything needed to establish a pattern that no rational person could dismiss as coincidence. I've entrusted these materials to my lawyer with instructions to release them publicly upon my death. I know that doing so will likely result in lawsuits, character assassination, and attempts to discredit my testimony. The Pembertons have money, influence, and 60 years of practice at silencing those who threaten their secret. But I'm an old woman with nothing left to lose, and sometimes the most powerful weapon against ancient evil is simply the refusal to remain silent. If you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and my story has finally been told. I pray that someone with more courage than I possessed will take up this burden. We'll find a way to expose the truth and save the children who would otherwise disappear into darkness. Millbrook Academy still stands in the Vermont mountains, still welcomes bright young minds to its hallowed halls. The brochures speak of academic excellence, of character building, of preparing students for leadership in an increasingly complex world. They don't mention the hunger that lives in the surrounding woods, the bargain that feeds on dreams and potential, the price paid in blood and terror for the school's remarkable success. I broke my silence after 60 years because some truths are too important to take to the grave. The entities that haunt Millbrook Academy derive their power from secrecy, from the conspiracy of silence that has protected them for over a century. Perhaps, if enough people know the truth, if enough voices are raised in accusation, that protection will finally crumble. The children who disappeared over the decades deserve to have their stories told. Sarah Whitmore, who fought until the end. The dozens of others whose names appear in police reports as runaways and suicides. The ones who will disappear in the years to come if nothing is done to stop the horror that masquerades as education in those ancient halls. I leave this account as my final testimony, my last attempt to balance the scales of justice after a lifetime of cowardly silence. Do with it what you will, but please, don't let my death mark the end of this story. Let it be the beginning of the end for Millbrook Academy and the unspeakable things that call its woods home. The shadows are closing in now, and I can hear whispers in languages that were old when the world was young. Perhaps they've come for me at last. These entities that brook no exposure of their feeding grounds. Or perhaps it's simply my time, and I'm hearing the voices of all those children calling from whatever dark place they've been taken to. Either way, I go to my rest knowing that I finally found the courage to speak the truth. May God have mercy on us all.
Eleanor Hartwell died peacefully in her sleep on March 15, 2024, at the age of 83, in accordance with her final wishes. Her lawyer has released this account, along with supporting documentation, to multiple news outlets and law enforcement agencies. As of the date of publication, Millbrook Academy continues to operate, and Dr. Marcus Pembridge has declined to comment on Mrs. Hartwell's allegations, citing them as the unfortunate delusions of a troubled mind. The investigation continues.